Good evening and welcome to another Northshire Presents virtual event. My name is David Wood. I'm the events manager at Northshire's Manchester, Vermont location, and I'm here as so often with my good friend and colleague Rachel Person from Northshire's Saratoga Springs location. And before we get started into today's event, just a couple of quick notes. If you have a question at any time during this event, please type it in the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll save those up for you and pose them at the end of the towards the end of tonight's event. And secondly, we really deeply appreciate your support of independent bookselling. It's not the easiest job in the best of times, and we haven't been there in a little bit. And so we really, our continued existence is really due to you. And we greatly appreciate you. Rachel, why don't you take things away?
Thank you so much, David. I'm really pleased to get to introduce our guest tonight. Allison Pataki is with us to celebrate the paperback release of her novel, The Marvelous Lives of Marjorie Post. She's the New York Times bestselling author of The Trader's Wife, The Accidental Empress, Cece, Where the Light Falls, and The Queen's Fortune, as well as the memoir Beauty in Broken Places, and two children's books, Nellie Takes New York and Poppy Takes Paris. Her novels have been translated into more than 20 languages. She will be interviewed tonight by friend of the bookstore, Natalie Jenner. Natalie Jenner is the author of the instant international bestseller, The Jane Austen Society and Bloomsbury Girls. A Goodreads Choice Award runner-up for historical fiction and finalist for Best Debut Novel, The Jane Austen Society was a USA Today #1 national bestseller and has been sold for translation in 20 countries. Please join me in welcoming them both to our screens this evening.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Hi, Natalie.
Hi, Allison. This is our first time meeting tonight. Yeah. I am so thrilled at this opportunity. I was counting up your books. It's like, I'm like so new to all of this. I'm still kind of like, I still feel like a debut. I debuted in the pandemic. And I look at all your amazing novels. And I'm so excited to chat with you tonight about your latest, just out in paperback, about honestly, the most incredible woman. And a few things jumped out at me. And I can't wait to kind of like dig in with you on some of the things that really jumped out at me in my research, both on you and the amazing book that you did. But I think the first question I wanted to ask you is, when you're thinking about writing the next book, and you've gotten, you've done like French Revolution and Habsburg Empire, but in a wonderful, wonderful, juicy way. What is for me, it's like it's the itch that I can't scratch. Or I call my friend Samantha Silva, the novelist, says it's like she's like a dog with a bone. Was there a moment for you with Marjorie as a concept for a book that stands out in your mind, like the light bulb moment, I guess?
Yes. Oh, I love that. The itch that you can't scratch. I refer to it as, I tell my husband, I'm like, I've been bitten. I've been bitten. And then it becomes a compulsion and an obsession. And you just know, like the little hairs on your neck. And you're like, I mean, it's been 7 years since I started researching this book, Marjorie, and it took 6 years to get it to publication. And then hopefully I'll talk about it for the rest of my life. So in order to say I'm going all in, I'm going to give this much of my life and commit to this story, it's got to be really a compulsion. And as you said, thank you for your lovely and generous introductory remarks. But as you said, I have been all over the place. My poor agent, my poor editor, like after I made the sale to them for The Trader's Wife that I was going to write about Peggy Shippen Arnold, and they were a little bit skeptical at first because this was Simon & Schuster. They said, the American Revolution doesn't really sell that well with fiction. At that point, we're going back to 2012. David McCullough could sell big male-driven biography, but they hadn't done, this was before Hamilton. And so I was like, I'm telling you, Martha Washington might not be sexy. She might not sell, but I'm telling you, Peggy Shippen Arnold is sexy. I promise I will answer your question and get to your point eventually. But anyway, after I wrote The Trader's Wife, they were like, okay, great. American Revolution. You've made it sell. Like, this can be your thing, right? Find your next woman from the American Revolution. And I was like, well, next I'm going to go to the Habsburg Empire in Austria and Vienna, different century, different language, everything. So anyway, I've been all over the place, but the only thing that has been the connecting thread with all of them, with the historical fiction at least, is finding this woman who was on the front row of history, major impact, major sweeping, stunning legacy, and yet not as well known with readers, particularly in America, Canada readers, that, as she should be, pulling her from the sidelines and putting her center stage. And so how I connected the dots from all of these various women and centuries, and then ended up at Marjorie, which was my 9th book and feels, it's my latest book, was I was meeting a friend of a friend for brunch. And this was back in 2016. And I had written the Trader's Wife, and I had written the 2 Cece books. And so this mutual friend had either read my books or knew of my books and said, you love these women from history, these big, juicy historical sagas. What do you think about Marjorie Post as a potential subject? And this friend had worked for years, had volunteered as a docent at Hillwood, Marjorie's final home. And so I said, I will be honest, embarrassed to admit this, I really didn't know much about Marjorie Post when she brought up the name. I heard Post and DC. I thought like maybe the newspaper family, like the Washington Post, or I thought maybe the Manners books, Emily Post, which is, pretty somewhat well known. But this friend was like, no, not anything to do with either of those. And she just gave me the facts: 4 marriages, 4 very juicy, dramatic divorces. The little tidbit about her being the post-food empire heiress, a little bit about her time in Russia. And she said, you should visit Hillwood, visit her final home, Hillwood in Washington, DC, which is now a museum. You might find her story to be interesting. And I went and visited, and I was obsessed. And I was like, how did I never know about this woman? And the rest is history.
I mean, I just love that. First of all, happy International Women's Day.
Exactly.
So this is like perfect,
it's the best day,
right? Yay.
Yeah.
Secondly, I mean, I think one of the tremendous gifts of historical fiction is shining that light on the voices that have not been as heard. And, I mean, so now, millions of people now know about Marjorie Post because of this book.
Oh, I wish it were millions.
A lot. What I love when I was reading your wonderful novel, what I loved about her as a person, for me as a reader, was her resilience. She was a project gal. Like, she would come out of a crisis and she'd be like, I'm going to start a new charity. I'm going to do this. And I loved her resilience, and I loved her philanthropy, because it showed how big-hearted she was. She never just thought of herself. Those are the 2 qualities that just were the through line of her life, right? She was always able to hold true to those qualities in her. What were the many qualities she had? What really resonated for you in the research and in the writing?
Absolutely. That strength you touched on with the resilience. And because you see, here's a woman who, she starts from the most humble of origins in Battle Creek, Michigan, but comes of age into incredible privilege and opportunity and wealth with the world at her fingertips, because she is the lone daughter of C.W. Post and the heiress of the Post food empire, which single-handedly is changing the entire American lifestyle and diet. And so she reaps the monetary benefits of the success of the company as her father's heir. And so you think, wow, privilege, great life. True, she certainly had that. But she had plenty of heartache, and she had plenty of challenges in her life. And also, as you said, her wealth, she saw it as a responsibility as much as a privilege. And she said, my wealth would have been a burden on my soul had I not found ways to use it to help others. So this was not an heiress who was hosting dinner parties and buying the latest fashion and gadding about the world. Sure, there was plenty of that. She hosted some great parties with all the presidents in attendance. She built Mar-a-Lago for herself as one of her many fabulous homes. But in spite of that, she was a woman of purpose. And, I always say, like, I wish I had a bracelet that was, what would Marjorie do? Because every single day she was busy. And in every single crisis that you see, she lives, through most of the 20th century, whether it's World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War. You find Marjorie most alive and most on fire as a human when she is serving causes larger than herself and when she is living with purpose. And so she wasn't content to just sit in her wealth as a society hostess. And so she broke the mold in a lot of ways. And so I found that to be incredibly inspiring. And also the resilience, I think a lot of that comes up with the fact that as an heiress and a society fixture, to get divorced one time was very scandalous and kind of could have been quite damaging to her position. Marjorie, which hopefully if people read the book and they see why, Marjorie had a lot of unhappy endings. And so you see in her personal life, when her heart is broken or when people sort of drop scandal on her doorstep that she never asked for, you see this strength and the resilience, and you see her continuing to just, I think, grow a little bit stronger. And so for me, one of the essential through lines was her finding her own identity and her own strength and power, separate and distinct from being the post heiress, separate and distinct from being a divorcee or this woman's wife, separate and distinct from just being the hostess of Mar-a-Lago, but finding her voice and her identity as women in America were really finding their voices and identity over the course of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's incredible. She's like a bit like Zelig. I mean, she lived through it all, right? Like she lived through both world wars. And it's really interesting to me when I think about her marriages. The one that sort of jumped out to me the most was with Joseph. The fact that he was he the second ambassador to Russia, FDR appointee? Yep. And I have to tell you, one of the things that's amazing about this book is that there's 20 books inside it. Because her life was so incredible. And just the stuff in Russia, my jaw was it was very unusual for anyone.
All true. It's
unbelievable. And the warehousing and the Fabergé eggs and everything, I could not believe it. She saw something that so few North Americans would have ever gotten to see.
Exactly. Over and over again in so many different circumstances. I like your analogy, and how I pitch it is she's like the Forrest Gump of the 20th century, but with way better clothing and way better houses. But the way he's just there for everything and then having a hand in it all, that's her. And then we just don't know about her. We don't learn about her in history. Yeah. But yes, one of the incredible things that was fundamental in her life and her adventure and her identity was she was the first United States ambassadress to the Soviet Union at the outbreak of World War II. Yeah. And so she was in Moscow. Talk about culture shock. She's leaving Palm Beach and Mar-a-Lago to sail aboard her private yacht to Moscow in January in the height of this there had been this revolution, there was famine, it was not a safe place. Secret police were trailing her. The Nazis and Stalin were plotting war with the West. It was a really, really wild time to be alive and to be in Moscow as an American ambassadress. And yes, she also comes into this moment where all of this priceless imperial Russian treasure is just collecting dust in warehouses because the ruling communists place no significance on treasure from the dead czars that they've murdered. And so all this treasure is sitting there. The Soviets are starved for cash. They will sell this Fabergé original treasure to anyone who has cash. They charge literally a ruble per gram. It's so just black and white. They just want money. Marjorie has the money. Marjorie has the passion for collecting and the sort of reverence for this priceless artistry. And so Marjorie becomes one of the largest collectors in the Western Hemisphere of Russian imperial treasure. And it's all, or a lot of it, is still at Hillwood, and you can see it. And it's insane. She amassed a museum's worth of treasure in her life.
I mean, yeah, that alone is nuts.
That alone.
On a more general level, when you are writing this intimately and over the long arc of a real life person's story, I know you have done this now with several different important women in history. There's this kind of responsibility to honor them, but also the truth of their life. So it's just sort of double-barreled, because the reason you're writing about them is because you're in love with them. You fall in love with what you write about. And that's why I love when you talk about writing in interviews, you talk about how joyful it is for you. And it's the same for me too. I'm very happy when I write, and it's very like, this is the happiest I kind of can be-ish. And it's very joyful. And I think that comes from being so lit up by who you're writing about or what you're writing about. And you're just so turned on by it. And I was wondering, you have to combine, like I said, that honoring them because you love them, but then also honoring the truth of what happened. And so you have to make hard decisions, right? About how much to cover, how much to show, what to leave out. Do you have sort of a mantra, or as a writer, have you learned and developed through, these many successful books, a way of intuitively knowing when something just is essential and you have to talk about it? Or is it easy for you? Is it more organic? Like you're just writing and you just write what appeals to you? Is there intent there?
Such a great question. And I love how you use the word honoring, because that's the word I use all the time. And I felt that especially with Marjorie.
Yeah.
And I felt an added level of responsibility and pressure to do this story justice for a few reasons. Number one, it's more recent history.
Yeah.
When I'm writing about French queens who have been dead for 300 years, there are gaping holes in the historical record. And that's where the writer of historical fiction gets to play and create and imagine, because there's a lot more space there. There was not much wiggle room in terms of the research and what was available in this story, because her home, Hillwood, is an entire museum dedicated to preserving her legacy. There are PhDs, scholars, and archivists who put the information out there for the world. So you can conceivably know pretty much what she did on every day of her life. It's very well documented. And I'm writing scenes where, her daughter, Dina Merrill, passed away while I was researching this book. I'm writing scenes while people who are present in the scenes are still alive, reading my book and coming to my launch events. So that is pressure. I hear from relatives living in Canada of Benedict Arnold on Facebook, like saying, oh, we always knew Peggy was involved, but that is a totally different level of intimacy with the story. And so I really did I did feel this pressure, and also just the amount of information that was out there, because I knew I wanted to start with the posts rolling into Battle Creek, the city that they would make into Serial.
I thought that was brilliant how you started the book. That scene with the train, like arriving there. I thought
they have nothing. And through this rivalry with the Kellogg family and what would ultimately become Kellogg cereal and Post cereal, these two great, businesses come up and change the entire American way of life. And I knew I wanted to start there. And then I knew she lived all the way up until the 70s. And so there was like a lot of ground to cover. And I told my editor, this book could be 800 pages, or I could write 8 different books and they could each have their own arc and they could each be a complete novel. So if I'm going to go the whole timeline, it was a lot. And I don't want it to just be kind of like I'm dumping information there. I want it to read like a narrative. So to answer your question, the negotiation between getting swept up in the narrative, telling the story as you feel sort of the emotional heart and truth of the story is, while honoring the facts, dates, characters. For me, it is a different negotiation with every book, because every set of raw material that I'm getting is different when I'm starting out to write the book.
Oh, I love that.
This is the one that I stayed the closest to, the history, because the history was just that good and I had no need to change it. And so I sort of think Lily King said this once at a book talk that I attended of hers, and I thought it was so brilliant. She said, if you're writing historical fiction, think about train tracks. And one of the rails is just a straight up timeline of the history that is there in the textbooks. And you're writing this narrative that runs alongside that. And at certain times the story comes close and certain times it veers away and sometimes it runs parallel. And this one I would say is the one of my books that ran the most parallel, because the history was that good. And I will have you know, when I gave copies of this book to members of the Post family, Dina Merrill has a grandson. They're all on the Sea Cloud right now together, by the way, on their yacht. I heard.
So wait a minute. So it's still in commission? Like it's still
running as a private, one could commission the Sea Cloud. life goals. And then, but also they do tourism, like as, for groups. So this one grandson of Dina Merrill's is the family historian, as he's told me, like he's digitized all the old family videos of Marjorie and E.F. Hutton swimming in the pool at Mar-a-Lago with baby Dina Merrill. And like, just like amazing. He just loves the history and he knows it. And he's written the history, like traced them all the way back to Charlemagne. And so he told me, he warned me beforehand that he would be a tough critic, a tough reader, and he was going to know what he thought. And he came to my book launch event at the National Art Society in New York City. And I was sweating bullets when I saw him walk in with his family. And at the end, he raised his hand and he asked for the mic, and I was panicking. And they were lovely. They've all been so gracious and so supportive, but he was like, we just want to thank you for putting our great grandmother's name out there, honoring her and telling her story to a next generation that maybe isn't as familiar. And as you said, you didn't have to make any of it up because it was just that outsized and that outlandish. And I was like, okay, the event is over. Nobody else needs to say anything.
Yeah, that's right.
But I was just like, yeah, I felt this need to honor her and tell her story with a level of credibility because I loved her, as you said, and I admired her.
Oh, you can see that love that you have for her. And again, I do think that writing historical fiction or nonfiction for you is a very, I don't want to say pleasurable, but
My happy place.
It's your happy place.
It's
And
playing.
aren't we lucky when the job and the passion are also that positive experience and not draining or nail bitingly, tense. Like it's like levitating a bit. It's really wonderful.
And then I get to talk to you, which is also the wonderful part of the
So
job.
the people haven't, like, I can't explain
Readers.
to people, like, it's so wonderful to have like an excuse to meet new people
Yes.
all the time that you admire. And when I was thinking about with like your first book being historical fiction, and did you see, I think of myself as someone who writes stories set in the past, and I'm a chicken. So I don't really portray real people. I make up my characters, but then I have cameos by people, but then I can't get into trouble because I don't know if you noticed, but I'm a former lawyer.
I love it. Yeah, so you know too much.
We're so terrified of being sued, right? Like
Uh-huh.
I could never, but I also don't have your skill set that you have of being able to be true to these real life people, but also make it so compelling. And I think of myself as like, okay, like I'll maybe have Sophia Loren show up for a chapter, but like that's like the most I can do. And I was thinking about when you sat down and had pitched your very first book, and you knew it was going to be about somebody real. It was going to be from that time period of American history with Benedict Arnold. Do you feel like you picked historical fiction, or did it pick you somehow? Because I know you're like an inveterate reader, like lifelong inveterate reader since you were a child. So was I, right? Like that was like the big passion was books. And we didn't have like historical fiction per se, maybe growing up. Like we didn't have as many genre categories. Like I remember those are the days when everyone read the Thornbirds.
Yeah.
And everybody read Jaws, right? Like I'm older than you, but in the 70s before you were born, in the 70s, like all the parents kind of like had the same thing at the Beach Lounger, it was like the same kind of books, it's just Shining, everyone's reading The Shining, whatever. Yeah. And I was wondering about this incredible genre where we get to play with history, we get to bring it to life, and we as writers get to live it. Like we're kind of like you said, I love that. Oh my gosh, the analogy from Louis King of the 2 train tracks. I love that concept of there's the actual history, and then there's the story that we're telling. And how intentional was the attraction to history? Because I know you have a journalism background as well. So with historical fiction as kind of only one of the types of writing that you do, but as a genre, what was it appeal to you, something that you really knowingly gravitated towards, or was it the story? Was it as simple as the story of Benedict Arnold's Way?
It picked me. The genre picked me years ago. I remember in middle school reading Lois Lowry's Number the Stars about the Jews in World War II and being like, I get to read about history, but it's also a book. And I just loved this concept of historical fiction so much. But what I always did as a child, and I grew up in the Hudson Valley, and we were speaking about this earlier. Yeah. There's a ton of Revolutionary War colonial history here because of the Revolutionary War and West Point being right across the river, and Benedict Arnold trying to turn over West Point. He lived in my town. And so I gravitated towards that because I loved it. I knew it. It felt like home court advantage. And I was obsessed with her history. And I just wanted to read a book about it. And there wasn't a book about it. So I thought, I have to write the book. But what I always did from my earliest memories was, as soon as I learned something about history, because I just love history and I love storytelling and I love narrative, I would just go into my head and I would just live it and imagine it. And still to this day, I cannot go to sleep at night without being in my head in some sort of made up historical scene that's playing out.
Oh,
Like,
I
that's
love that.
where my brain goes when,
Oh gosh, tell
if
me
I'm
more
in a
about that.
car,
That's
or that's like my
fascinating.
state of flow, right? That's where I go when I'm like in my alpha, my head is like free to think. And so I thought, I can just put it on paper and then that can be my hobby. And I was writing news during the day. And then I had a few books that I was secretly sort of working on, and I would let my roommate read some, or I'd let my parents or my husband, at the time, my boyfriend, who's now my husband. And then I thought, geez, I'm really miserable in news. I actually really did not enjoy or thrive writing news. I found it very stressful and very just get in, get out, spark outrage, spark fear, whatever it is, and then move along to the next thing. And to raise the viewer's heart rate, but also my heart rate. So I would get home at the end of the day and I would write fiction as a relief and a release. And I thought, maybe, is there a way to actually do this? Maybe this is actually my calling. This is what I'm meant to be doing. So anyway, I feel like the genre chose me. I read everything, but my true love for reading is historical fiction. And they say, it's for it, especially when you start out, you write what you know. That's what I do. And that's what I loved. And in some ways, it almost feels like cheating, because the history, when you land on someone like Marjorie Post or Peggy Shippen or, whomever that you're passionate about, the history gives you the plot. So I don't have to worry like, oh, I don't know where this plot is going, because I know where the history is going. So in some ways, to me, it feels easier. But then in other ways, it's more challenging, because you have to put it right, or at least to the level of credibility. And there will always be people who know when you veer from the history, they will call you on it. And that pressure, that pressure to get it.
Yeah. No, that's just so interesting as you were talking, because I was thinking about how when I had been in this really difficult time in my life with my husband's health, I had not written for a long time because I had failed after 20 years. I was not getting published. I even opened a bookshop of my own because I wanted to stay close to books and have books be a bigger part of my life. And then when my husband was dealing with this health crisis, I turned to Jane Austen, and then I turned to writing. And it became this great gift. And then to be able to share this gift with others. And you've written children's books, you've written the memoir about your husband with his stroke, and you've written journalism, and you've written historical fiction. And when are you most, this is a bad question. I'm going to change the question. I want to ask you when you're
bad question.
Well, what is the writing that you find is the most helpful for you? Because I think some people would assume that nonfiction memoir writing, for example, almost like journaling, right? It's a conscious exploration of the real life. But for me, I can't write nonfiction the way you can. I can't write memoir. I need to create a world. And then when I'm in that world, my imagination and my subconscious are doing hard emotional work, but making it pleasurable for me. Because I'm a little chicken and a little scaredy cat, and maybe I don't want to think about these things. So the gift of fiction for me, and the gift of immersing myself in someone else's life and world, is that I get to do this work that I need to do, this emotional work, but I trick myself. And I was wondering, for you as a writer, when do you feel that the writing is also a catharsis or a help, or doing more than the obvious?
Oh, isn't it also amazing how after so many years of trying, your book, you're ultimately like your baby, your success that started things off for you, and this next phase of your career came out of your darkest moments. I love that. And that
it really is the whole point of, I think, Jane Austen's writing, and the whole point of my debut book was about hope. And one of the things I admire with people like Marjorie, and I'm going to make you go back to my original question, but one of the things I admired about her so much was it's not about wealth, because there's lots of wealthy people that lose hope, right? it's about that ability to love again
Yes.
and to live again
Yes.
and to build again.
Yes,
And, you know,
exactly.
it's the entrepreneur in her, right? And so,
You
but
got
that's,
it,
so that's what
Natalie.
that's what I really took away.
You got my heart and soul. You got it
Yeah.
from the book.
No, but that is, yeah. But anyway, so back
Yeah,
to you,
absolutely.
though.
So I would say they've all, oh man, so historical fiction just felt like the most natural and is the one I keep coming back to and is sort of my bread and butter as a writer. Like it's, you know, Marjorie is my most recent book. My next book will be historical fiction. I will always,
I know, Emerson, I'm so excited.
I will always, American Bloomsbury. We have to talk about that.
Yeah.
I will always write and read historical fiction. I never intended to write the nonfiction memoir. And what happened, the quick backstory was when my husband had his stroke at age 30 and he survived it improbably and woke up, he was completely amnestic. He was in a state of total amnesia. And so how our healing process began in large part, or at least my processing process began, was on the page and through writing. And I would write Dave these letters every night because I couldn't count on myself to remember everything that had happened in these intense, exhausting, sad, hopeful days. And I hoped that someday he'd want to know, and that someday he would be there and present enough to ask questions. And then, as you said, it became a journaling process for me. And ultimately this cathartic healing thing where after a year of these letters, I thought, my gosh, nobody who's walked with us through this year, even his parents or my parents or our closest friends who've been the most exposed to our story, no one knows this whole thing, including Dave and including me. I hadn't even processed this whole thing. So it's like the writing the book was this huge process of getting everything off my chest and giving it to Dave, hoping that someday I'd give it to our children, and thinking, when I came home from the hospital at the end of these days, I could have really benefited from reading something like this and just knowing that I wasn't alone, that others had walked a road like this one alongside me, before me. And that if I could keep walking, things would begin to feel like life again for all of us. And so writing was just, it was, I thought I had my writing, which was my fiction. And then it never occurred to me that this was also writing. This was like my therapy. That was like my joy.
Yeah.
It never occurred to me that this would also be a book. So that was important for that experience and that moment. But I don't have any immediate plans to write nonfiction again. And then the children's books to me feel like jumping in an ice cream sundae after doing the hard work of 400 pages of adult fiction and deep historical research.
And years of work, years of work.
And then the children's books are just joy, and readings with children are just joyful and fun. And I have 3 little ones. I have a 7, 4, and 1-year-old. And so it's very much what I'm reading now as well, and what I'm living. And so I would love to do more children's, and I would love to do more historical fiction. And I have these crazy dreams of someday writing YA or middle grade for like middle schoolers. So Natalie, I'm all over the place.
No,
I
I
don't
love
even
it.
know. Can I answer by saying all of the
No,
above?
because I can only do one thing. I can only write a novel. That's it. It's so sad. But you know, when you were talking about this experience with your husband and how he was, because of the state he was in, not able to process what was going on, and that was the motivation partly to keep the record, but also for you, the overwhelming intensity of the days. And I was thinking about Marjorie. To bring it back to her, I was thinking about the judgmentalism of society at the time, or even now, frankly, of having 4 marriages and like, what is it you're getting wrong? But what she was doing is coming out of a bad marriage. She was looking forward, and she was saying, I don't want to. That thing you said, it was so beautiful about was it David, your husband? Is that his name? About you and David, about nobody else really knows. That's what my husband and I felt. And I always say to my daughter, I have one child and she's 21. I always say to her, at the end of the day, so I get a little emotional, it's just you and your husband at the end of the day when the lights go out, right? And that's an intense, wonderful gift to have. And it's awful when it doesn't work out. And I could so understand Marjorie wanting to always move forward to find someone else
Yeah.
that she would have that with. I considered her very strong.
Yes. Yes. Because each of the 4 marriages were completely different. Each set of life circumstances into which she entered these marriages were totally different. You look at her as a young girl in the beginning, the first marriage to Ed Close, who is Glenn Close's grandfather, by the way. So it's a good thing their marriage didn't work out, because otherwise Glenn Close. But that was an Edwardian Downton Abbey era. It was a totally different world when she got married as a young, basically child bride. And truly how I wrote it, he proposed after a few days.
Yeah.
They were young, they were teenagers. It was a summer romance. What could possibly go wrong? It was not a Nicholas Sparks novel. Let's just put it that way. And so but then the second marriage with E.F. Hutton, who she called Ned, who the rumor was that they were the inspiration for The Great Gatsby, because they're living in the jazz age, roaring 20s. They're hosting the parties that F. Scott Fitzgerald is going to as he's writing about The Great Gatsby. And that was a totally wild part of her life as well. And you can't see the ending for that one coming necessarily either. And that's a total shattering heartbreak for her. And then you can see why your boy Joe Davies, her third husband, why that is such a unique, powerful attraction, and why they end up together and the adventures they have going to the Soviet Union and Nazi Europe. And then you see why that one ends. And then you see the fourth marriage and that scandal and how that one ends. And she just never saw that one coming. And so Marjorie was such a smart woman, and people kept asking her, like someone said to her, you could run US Steel, you could run the State Department.
Yeah.
Why can't you pick a husband and then it works out? And she said, I don't know, ain't it hell? And it was true. But as you said, her willingness to love again, to believe in love, to try again was one of the things I loved the most about her, and her vulnerability. And it softened her as a human, I think. And someone said to her, a friend said after her third divorce, which was shattering and devastating to her, 3 times around the track, it's once more back to the post. And for me, I loved that, because for me, she kept coming back to Marjorie. Who she was Marjorie Merriweather Post. She wasn't Mrs. Close. She wasn't Mrs. Hutton, Mrs. Davies, Mrs. May. She always came back to she was Marjorie, and got a little bit stronger each time and picked herself back up. And she's going to be okay. And so in spite of the failed marriages, I did not feel that this story was one of failed love, because ultimately her life was full of love. And you see that in her 3 daughters, in her reams of grandchildren with whom she was incredibly close, in the friendships, in the beautiful homes she left, in the beautiful art and collection, and in the philanthropy, and in all of the good she did. And she said, make it work. There are others. I'm not the richest woman in the world. There are others who are better off than me. The difference is that I do more with mine. I put it to work. And she put it to work, and she left the world a more beautiful place in so many countless untold ways. And so ultimately it's a beautiful, inspiring story in spite of the heartbreaks.
I mean, I think that's part of its appeal for readers. I think that's why it's been so well received and so lovingly received, because that, I love when you said that she had been softened by these experiences in marriage and in love, because what could be bad about what the woman that came out of each marriage, she was really able to not, it doesn't sound like from your book at least, to not be beaten down, to lose. She never lost self-esteem. She never became bitter. She never became like so negative. She used the ending of the marriages, or the ending of the love, to take on something outside herself. Usually that was often, I think, a nexus, right? With her decision to like, I'm going to actually go do this for other people. So it was like the experience of love and then losing love. And then she wanted to share with others what she could, as part of her emotional healing, which if you think about it, Allison, is so brilliant, right?
Yes.
I mean, I think it was, I send my daughter all of the Dalai Lama tweets because they're so brilliant, right? Yeah. And then, like, I send them to her on text in the morning. I'm like, the Dalai Lama says.
Just for today, just keep this in mind.
there was one from a few weeks ago where he said, you will never be unhappy if you take time to think about others. And it was very simple, but that's what she did. that was her fuel.
She really did. And she would pour that heartbreak and energy or disappointment into the next great thing, whether it was funding the largest wartime hospital in World War I France, or feeding thousands of hungry people during the Great Depression, or giving her yacht to be commissioned by the US Navy in World War II, or hosting wounded veterans, allowing them to convalesce at Mar-a-Lago, or building another beautiful home, which she would then leave to be enjoyed by others. So yeah, I almost got this sense in her spirit that she would get restless in times of incredible bounty and decadence and leisure, and then would find purpose in times of great trial, and in moments when she could really serve purposes and people and things larger than herself.
No, it's wonderful. So are there any questions from the audience?
Ooh.
We do have some audience questions that have already come in, and audience members, please use the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of the screen to ask any further questions you have. We're going to start off with this one that came from Anissa for both of you, Natalie and Allison, asking, do you lead your characters or do they lead you?
That is such a great question. Do you want to start, Natalie?
Yes, because they lead me 100%. I always say to people, I feel like I'm like the tin cans tied to the back fender of the car. I'm just like hanging on for dear life, because I make it up very much. And the real life is more supplemental in my books. And then my third book comes out next March. It's the same thing all over again. So I definitely love just seeing where they take me. And also, Anissa, hello. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I find that my characters keep secrets from me, which is why I write. I write to find out what the secrets are that they're keeping from me. Otherwise, they feel very real. They're figments of my imagination. So Allison, your answer will be very different, I would say.
Great answer and great question, Anissa. Thank you so much. So how I will describe it, and how I've sort of described it to myself to try to make sense of what is going on in my head. Because I'm writing historical fiction, I know usually when I start out, beginning and important dates I want to hit and important characters who are going to be inhabiting this world. But then the first draft for me is after this huge push of research up front. And with the research up front, I'm just taking in as much as I can. And I'm throwing all of the ingredients into a big pot with no rhyme or reason or understanding of how it's all going to shape up. And at a certain point in the research, we'll take Marjorie as an example. The Marjorie of my research comes to life and becomes this different Marjorie in my head, who then begins to start talking and acting and showing me her story. And at that point, I know it's time to switch from the research to writing the first draft. And when I'm writing the first draft, it's like I am walking through this dark cave and I have a little tiny candle and I'm seeing one step at a time. And I am writing to see and discover the next step. And the story is pulling me forward with these characters. And so my first drafts are not pretty, but I am telling myself the story with my first draft. Then the second and third and fourth up to 100th, because I write in a lot of drafts. I'm really a drafter. I'm not like a first version, get it right, but just I'm an edit, fine tune. Then I'm thinking, this is the character. This is how I'm seeing it in my head. Now I want to think about how I'm creating that for the reader and how I'm putting that down on the page. And so then it's about fine tuning and shaping, but very much so the characters are leading me.
Oh, I love that.
I couldn't write the book unless the character was leading me, and unless the character felt so real to me that I wanted to follow and go along on that story.
No, that makes so much sense. I love that that's your answer, because I wanted that to be your answer. But I personally, one of the reasons I can't write the way you do is because I'm like, I don't know how you do that, right? But there's that porousness with the research, right? And I love that there's this idea of these multiple drafts and that you have to shift gears from the first draft, onwards, which is not my approach. So thank you for that answer, Allison, because that just really helps me understand the skill that's going into what you're doing, because it is different for me. I'm like the first draft. I think it's gold. I finished the first draft. I write it sentence by sentence. Like, honestly, it's ridiculous. It's like I'm watching it through a movie camera and I'm just writing down what I see. And then I give it to an agent and I'm like, okay, we're done. He's like, are you on drugs? Like,
That's amazing.
this is just the beginning. I'm like, no, I've told the story. It ends. I know what happens.
That's such a good way of putting it, though, that you're watching it on a camera.
Yeah.
Like, it's very clear to you.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh man, I'm like digging through a dark cave. It's not clear to me.
Thank you both so much. There's another question here, and it's also for both of you.
Yes.
What is a book on your bookshelves that would surprise us
Yeah.
based on the books that you write?
I love that question. I read everything. So
Yeah.
don't be surprised, because I literally read every genre. I don't know that this would surprise anyone, because I feel like everyone in the world has read it, but I Spare, it's not historical fiction, but I love a great story. I love a great narrative. I love great characters. It's a really compelling story. One of the things I love most about historical fiction is that it takes us into the scenes of the bedrooms and the boardrooms, and we get to be flies on the wall. And I feel as though that's what Harry has done with Spare. He's taken us into those scenes and those moments and told us what it felt like to be him in those moments. And I love that, no matter what the genre is. And then I'm often like, this is a real departure from what I write, but I'm often reading family books. Like, I'm reading Dr. Becky Good Inside, about children, raising children who are good inside. And I've got like stacks. I'm reading Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, just came out with a historical fiction novel, A Most Intriguing Lady. I just started that, loving that, love historical fiction. It's set in the Victorian era. So yeah, those are three answers.
I'm listening to Spare.
Mhm.
And he does, and like an incredible, he has a really great voice. It's wonderful. I read a lot of male authors from the 20s and 30s. So I don't know if people would think this about me. I do have a somewhat spare prose style, so maybe it's not surprising, but I read a lot of Hemingway constantly, a lot of Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, J.D. Salinger is all over my bookshelves, like just a lot of sort of mid-century, mid-20th century male authors, many of whom served in war. Like, I don't know what it is. There's something about that time period. I mean, one of the reasons I love the book that Allison's just had released in paperback is because I get to kind of sink into the 20s and 30s again, which is a favorite time for me. So I love writers from that time period, and a lot of behind the scenes books of industries. Like, I'm the kind of person that has never seen Jerry Seinfeld's podcast about, coffee but I will listen to his book about the making of the podcast. Like, what is that? Or James Burrows has a great book out right now, because he was the director on everything from Mary Tyler Moore through Will and Grace, Taxi, Cheers, all these, and I'm like, oh, the making of the American sitcom, because I love sitcoms. So then I'll read that. So I read a lot of entertainment heavy books, I find.
And
too.
you like to know the story behind the story.
I love stories about creating, basically.
Yeah.
I love especially when I can't do something. I don't know, Allison, if you picked up on that tonight, but when I can't do something, I am fascinated by people who can. Like, I used to be a career coach for 20 years. Like, light bulbs are going off now, right? I'm like, oh yeah, Natalie, that's why.
I love that. I love that.
So we have a question from Meredith for you, Allison. She wants to know if you had a chance to visit Camp Topridge while you were researching.
I did. Oh, okay. Great question. So Marjorie built so many homes. I had to leave some out because my editor and I were like, okay, here's another section about building homes with King Louis XVI chandeliers, and just so lavish and grandiose. I was like, how many homes can I expect the readers to want? Well, I feel like Natalie would like it because she likes the building things, the behind the scenes, but I didn't want to put too much of that in there. So I would say at the end of her life, the great homes of her heart were Fall and spring, we're always at Hillwood, her mansion in Washington, D.C., which was an amazing story of how she built it. And the joke was that she really, really wanted to get this amazing view of the Washington Monument. But because she couldn't move the French doors of her drawing room, she just had to move the Washington Monument so that the view would be perfect. But that's an amazing place. That was kind of her home base in the shoulder seasons, and you can visit. It's a museum. In the winter, it was Mar-a-Lago, which she wanted to leave to the federal government as the winter White House. And the federal government could not keep up the home that Marjorie Merriweather Post could keep up as a one-woman show. So they had to decline the offer, but Mar-a-Lago. But then her summer haven and retreat and her happy place that she built and loved for decades, from the 1920s up until the 1970s, was Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks. And that is the only one of her beloved final homes that is now privately owned. It was owned by New York State. She left it to Governor Nelson Rockefeller, but under Governor Mario Cuomo, he sold it, and it was privately owned by the Crow family. I had the opportunity. The Crows were incredibly generous, and they allowed me to visit Camp Topridge in the summer, which was when Marjorie would have been there. They allowed me to stay the night in Marjorie's cabin. I use the word cabin loosely. It is left almost exactly how Marjorie left it. The bathroom is an explosion of pink, because Marjorie's bathrooms were always explosions of pink. You know, this is an Adirondack cabin, and it's like Versailles. It was her original watercolor artwork that her grandchildren had made for her, like right by her bed. Her hairs were in the brush. And there was a lock that the Crow family said had never been cracked. They don't know what's in this safe that is in this lock. Her family has disputed that, but the Crows say that this safe that's in there has never been opened. And I felt like at a certain point in the night, museum security guards were going to have to escort me out, because I truly felt like I was in this hallowed space, this sacred space when you are in a museum, like the energy, how it feels. But I stayed there. I didn't sleep a wink. I was so excited. I was so amped up the whole night. And in the morning, you know, something that was very evocative for me was how no matter what was going on in her life, if it was a world war, if it was a scandal from a divorce, she went there and she felt peace, and it was rustic. And the Adirondacks, it still feels that way there. You still look out in the morning and see the loons skimming the surface of the lake with the mist, and you hear the cry of the loons. And I thought, this is exactly what Marjorie would have seen and heard and felt in this space. And so to Natalie, your point earlier, used the word honor. That was a moment where I took my coffee and I went out onto the water, and I had this quiet moment in the morning, and I said this sort of silent meditative prayer to her and of thanks for her life and her story, and setting out the intention out into the world that I wanted to honor her story, because I really felt her story while I was there. So yes, I visited Topridge. I will always count it as one of life's great moments, and I was so thankful to be there in her world.
Rachel, can I jump in with I'm going to make this the shortest version of how I wrote my debut novel, but I spent a year reading Jane Austen to get through this difficult time. And I said to my family, I want to walk in Jane Austen's footsteps. But Allison, the difference was I didn't know I was going to write a book. I thought I was never going to write again. And when I go to the town and I see the house, I'd been there before, but this trip was different. And I went to Winchester and I went to her grave and I laid flowers, because it was actually the 200th anniversary of her passing when I was there. And I laid flowers, which is something very whimsical, which I would never normally would do. And I got very emotional. And I remember just the weight of the presence of this person as evidenced by their home, when you use the word evocative. And then 9 months later, I sat down and just started to write. And so it was like I had like the mirror image experience of you, except I didn't know that there was a book coming. You knew there was a book coming, but the result was sort of, we got to the same place.
It was like a pilgrimage for you. Yeah. I love that.
Thank you. There's another question for both of you from Megan. She says, to both of you, when you write, do you start to feel protective of your characters?
Oh, yeah, I do. Especially, for instance, with Marjorie. Let's take the example of the 4 husbands, the 4 divorces. I found myself always taking her side because I was so steeped in her head and her heart and her pathos. So I really do. And like Empress Cece with my Cece books, I feel this great protective vibe for her. So absolutely, because I think I'm not writing these women because I see myself in them or like their lives in any way. I'm not an empress yet, you know, of a dynasty. So it's not like it's autobiographical at all. But surely you feel a connection with them to write with them and to want to enter so intimately into their world. And so I think that comes with the territory, is then you feel this protection for them. How about you, Natalie?
You know, it's interesting, as you were talking, I was realizing that I don't have anything to protect because my characters are much more like they're fictional, right?
Yeah.
However, I see it in my endings because I am notorious for these epilogues where I give everybody everything they wanted. Everybody gets exactly what they wanted. And I actually almost write them cinematically. And Rachel, you know this because I think you've read both my books, right? And I just like, and then this, it's like the ending. Oh, well, again, it's like the ending credits to a movie. You know, they say, and so went on to do this with their life. That's how the endings of all my books read. And it's very much the protectiveness for me with my characters is I love them so much. I wouldn't be writing about them otherwise. They probably are a little bit of my psyche, you know, in a different, you know, form. And I'm going to be Oprah Winfrey and Santa Claus and God all wrapped into one. And I sit there and I write the epilogues in one go, crying, and then I send it to my agent. And it's like the one thing that we never touch because it is. And then people are like, oh, is your next book going to have another one of your happy endings? I'm like, yes.
But I love that. And also Jane Austen gives us a little bit of that, you know.
Exactly. Very well put. Yes.
My grandma lived to 102, and one of her hard and fast rules in life, from being an immigrant child in the tenement, always take cod liver oil every morning, which Marjorie did during the Spanish influenza, and only read books and watch movies with happy endings. And you know what? She lived to 102. So she's doing something right.
Unfortunately, we are almost out of time, but that is a perfect place to wrap up on the idea of a happy ending and giving ourselves joy with our reading, which both of you very much do. Thank you so much for being with us tonight and for this lovely conversation.
Thank you so much to everyone who joined in Northshire and Saratoga and Vermont. And Natalie, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me tonight as well.
You can order both books at northshire.com and check out other upcoming events there as well. Thank you so much and have a great night, everybody.